I'm co-director of the Inclusion Initiative with my colleague, Associate Professor Grace Lorden. This new research centre at the LSE launched in November of last year, and it brings together behavioural science and data to create more inclusive cultures. Over the next 3 years, you can expect a steady stream of rigorous and relevant research from the Inclusion Initiative. We're currently working on a number of fantastic projects, and that includes exploring how artificial intelligence can be used to promote inclusion in the workplace, to considering how luck versus effort is attributed across groups, to quantifying how COVID-19 has affected the workforce in different ways. Do follow us on Twitter at LSE_TII, or sign up to our newsletter, and directions on that will be put on the chat box right now. The event will be recorded, can be listened to later, and do pose questions for the last 20 minutes of this. Do post them in the chat box, because generally it's the most interesting part of any recording. This is the fourth of our Open Door, Open City webinars. The name speaks for itself. It's an aim to open the door of the city to business, to all talent, and for all talent to be there in their entirety and to make sure their voices are heard. And that is the best way to create a culture of innovation, a culture of profitability. Now, we are honoured to have as our guest Alderman Tim Hailes, an award-winning derivatives and regulatory lawyer with an outstanding career at JP Morgan, who's now at fintech company Five Islands Capital as general counsel. And he's likely to be the first openly gay Lord Mayor for the City of London, meaning Lord Mayor is basically the global ambassador for the City of London, but this is all subject to election by the Court of Aldermen. Now, as we head into February's LGBT+ History Month, it seems appropriate to ask you, Tim, what does it mean for the community, and what does it mean for the City of London? You're becoming the 694th or 95th, 96th Lord Mayor in a few years from now.
Well, thank you, Karina, and thanks very much for the invite, and hello to everyone who's joined us. Look, symbolism obviously matters, and this office has existed since 1189, and you sort of gave the game away a little bit by the word openly. I'm quite sure that there has been predecessors of mine who have been LGBT or in the past. But for the community, you know, I suppose the parallel is when I became sheriff. So one of the things you have to do before you become Lord Mayor is serve as Sheriff of the City of London. Yes, it's exactly like being Sheriff of Nottingham, same office. But you spend the year physically residing in the Old Bailey. And the Old Bailey, of course, has a very long and rich history. But for the LGBT community, it has a particular history because, of course, it was at the Old Bailey that various people have been sentenced under criminal law in the past, including most famously Oscar Wilde. And so little things like being able to put the rainbow flag up over the Old Bailey for the first time in its history as sheriff send very powerful messages of change. And I think, you know, we look over the pond at the first female vice president in the history of the United States. And I think she said it's not about her. It's most certainly not about me. But it does actually say to people that these offices are accessible to everybody, irrespective of your background, your skin color, your sexual identity, your sexuality, or what gender you are. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does, and it's a very positive answer, but I wonder whether there is a disconnect between the modernizing city, the city that in some ways is at the forefront globally, and what you actually have is this, what's called the civic city, which at times appears rooted still in the Middle Ages, and not just in the amazing robes you wear, but in its culture. I mean, do you think that part of the city is structurally homophobic?
Gosh, you started with an easy question and then you really served one straight down the line there. Look, we're dealing with conservative, small c tradition. All traditions start off as innovations when they are first done, and then they, of course, get rooted in the established way of doing things. And I think what you're touching on really is culture. and whether there is a culture there and a set of systemic issues which are inhibitive to inclusion and diversity, whether that's your LGBT or a woman or whatever. And the honest answer is there is a way to go still. I believe that the business city, by which I mean financial and professional services, which I've spent my entire professional life working in, have changed beyond all recognition since 1994, when I was a trainee at a law firm and one of the very, very few openly gay lawyers in the entire city of London. We've come a very long way. And I think that the civic city, whether that's talking about the historic guilds, whether it's talking about the institutions of the civic offices, is on a journey. It has some way to go still. So, for example, it really should not be necessary in today's modern age for a Lord Mayor, or indeed a female Lord Mayor, to have a consort or a Lady Mayoress. If you happen to be single or a widower or whoever you are, this should not be a prerequisite. It should not be structurally built into the system. And we have been making those changes. And so, yes, of course, difference means literally doing things differently. It doesn't mean that we can't have the traditional model, if you like, but it does mean that we need to look very, very carefully at whether we have either explicit or implicit bias in the structures that we have and the way that we go about things. We still, to this day, have one livery company which does not admit women. I think that is shocking. And that is something that I've been quite public in my views upon. I want to see change. I do very strongly believe in carrying people with you. And I think sometimes people struggle to know what it is they need to do to effect change because it's territory they're not comfortable with. And actually, some people are just scared of asking the wrong question or saying the wrong thing. I personally believe there is enormous goodwill out there. And I also believe, and I wouldn't be sat here having this conversation, frankly, if there wasn't the possibility of my progressing to high office. So, that says something about the dynamic. But I do think people sometimes need help in that process. And, we start with actually listening to people and asking the sorts of questions that you're asking. So, there are pockets there still which, are resistant to change. But I think the general direction of travel in the last few years has been very good.
One of the ways of taking people with you in the private sector, if you will, the financial and professional services, has been through money. I mean, money talks, and money in a way makes the conversation almost simpler. So, for example, tying compensation to inclusion has always seemed a sensible thing to do. How have you, in your career, especially I think at JP Morgan, used the power of money to change behavior?
So I think we sometimes forget here in 2021 quite what it was like in 1994. And I'm sure there will be people watching this webinar who, weren't working in 1994, maybe not even around in 1994. So in 1994, when I first became a trainee solicitor at a law firm, it was a very, very conservative environment. I was an articled clerk, if anyone can remember that far back, which meant that you signed a contract of indenture effectively with a particular partner. And when I arrived in my firm, I found that the partner who I was the articled clerk was an evangelical Christian. Now, labels are very dangerous, and I subsequently found that my presumptions around what he might or might not think about this issue were very different to the reality. But it was quite a challenging environment to be in. Fast forward to today, and this is very much part of the corporate DNA. We weren't always there. So in the early noughties, 2000s, I was a client. I was sourcing work to external counsel, and quite a significant amount of work at that. And JP Morgan, and with the support of the then regional general counsel and general counsel, who were fantastic, called in all the law firms, and we had a client seminar with Stonewall at a point when the whole workplace inclusion program at Stonewall was very, very early days. And we allowed senior partners and relationship partners to ask questions about what all this really meant in terms of affecting change in corporate culture. And that was, if you like, the sort of the carrot. The stick was we made it quite clear that in our RFPs going forward.
What's an RFP.
Requests for proposal, so instructions.
Yeah.
Look, we're always going to want to source work to the most technically competent firms, but let's be frank, a number of you will tick that criteria. So how are we going to differentiate? And the answer is we're going to start to differentiate on the basis of shared values and culture. And if we don't see employee network groups, we don't see the sorts of things that we're developing being replicated in the financial services market, in legal professional services particularly, then that will be taken into account. And that caused a front page headline banner story in the Lawyer newspaper. It certainly got a lot of attention. My good friend Daniel Winterfeld set up Into Law as a direct reaction to that. And so, you know, it started a process of the proverbial stone rolling down the slope, as it were. Yeah. And we haven't stopped since. And so, you know, that's the power of the client. If you want to be more blunt, money talks. And that was something that we felt very strongly we wanted to do as a firm at the time.
But, you know, what's interesting about your story is, yeah, it's money talks, but it's also about stonewalling in there and helping educate. Because as you say, a lot of people are afraid of offending. So, for example, you know, you have a number of people who will say to me, well, what exactly does LBGT plus stand for? And why is there something in Q? But they're afraid of asking these questions. So education is a big part of it. And what, you know, if you had to say, and I know 3 is an arbitrary number, but if you had to say 3 things you would want companies to do to help them on the journey, what would those 3 things be?
So I think people are doing a lot already. So part of me wants to say more of the same, please. Look, I think one of the things that we've seen recently around the BLM issue is listening is an underrated skill. And so, you know, we all talk too much. I know I do. I'm going to be doing a lot of it on this call. But actually listening to other voices and other perspectives is incredibly important. And creating channels where those voices can be heard is also very important. So we have employee-led groups in many financial professional services firms now. I think one of the number one thing to do is you must listen. So I'll give you an example. So there is a statue in the Guildhall of a very famous Lord Mayor, William Beckford. That statue, for many people, commemorates a Lord Mayor who stood up to the Crown and the Crown autocracy and represents freedom of speech. But Beckford made his money off slavery. And so for many members of the BAME community, that statue represents oppression. And until I had that conversation with Patricia Scotland, who is a very good friend, Secretary of the Commonwealth, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, to be honest. And, you know, what she sees in her lived experience and what I see is very different. And that's really, at the end of the day, what inclusion and diversity is about, right? It's listening to other perspectives and having that conversation around these sorts of issues. So I think listening is the first thing. You know, look, it's illegal to positively discriminate. And I've never been one for quotas and tokenism. I find it patronizing. I'd like to think that I've succeeded in my professional career because of who I am and my abilities and what I bring as an employee, not through some sort of tokenism. But you can take positive steps. You can do positive actions. So you can deploy tools like mentoring. You can have open days. You can have targeted networking. You can think about things in a, I'm going to come back, less traditional way. When I talk to delivery companies about how do they broaden their membership, particularly if they're not guilds, livery companies connected to a particular trade like banking or the law today, the way I phrase it to them is you need to widen the gate. You don't need to lower the bar. In other words, no one is saying you have to compromise on standards or people who would be interested in the sorts of things that they do. You just have to throw the net wider and you have to be creative about how you do that. If you carry on doing things the way they've always been done, and funnily enough, nothing will ever change.
Now, can I just burrow into one of your things that you were saying about diversity and inclusion? Because we at the Inclusion Initiative, we define inclusion as Within the firm, diverse voices should be heard in collaborative discussions, and leaders must work to bring the missing voices into the firm to aid its purpose and profitability. This seems more or less what you're saying, or is there something you feel we've missed there?
No, I think that's pretty spot on. I mean, look, in recent years, there's been a much more powerful case made around the quotes business case for being inclusive, because we all talk about the talent war, and we all talk about, you know, competition, certainly in a sector like financial professional services, and that's all true, and all the things that we've touched upon in terms of accessibility, recruitment, and the tools that you've identified. That it's all true. There was one other thing though, and it is the right thing to do. So let's not underplay the moral issue here. Treating people with mutual respect is, I think, just a basic human civility, for want of a better phrase. So yes, I'm absolutely there in terms of the business case. But I also think from a societal point of view, from a social point of view, from a mutual respect for other people, that's an important component too. It's not just about the bottom line.
Thank you, Tim. That was very well said. I'd now like to move on to Brexit and financial and professional services. Now, you don't have to agree with this statement because you obviously need to be a diplomat, but let's just say that most people believe the city was left out to dry by this government, who didn't actually push our case at all, even though we're responsible for some of the major tax revenues coming into the country. So the city basically got a raw deal from this government in the Brexit negotiations. And I mean, given that, for example, let's focus in first on derivatives because it is your specialty. How do you see this raw deal affecting the sector, from everything from inventing new derivatives to trading to clearing?
Well, so I think to describe the city reaction to the Brexit deal as disappointing is probably where I would put it. Look, I understand the politics, and at the end of the day, it's for the national government to determine the political settlement. But as you started out by saying, the role of the Lord Mayor is to be an advocate for the financial and professional services sector of the UK. That represents, 10.5% of all UK tax comes from UK financial professional services. And if you narrow it to corporation tax, it's 25%. It's about £75.5 billion. That pays for an awful lot of hospitals and doctors and schools. And so there is a meeting, if you like, of the financial imperative and the political imperative here. I think we employ across the UK financial professionals probably 1.1 million people. And so all these statistics are terribly interesting, but at the end of the day, it boils down to jobs, it boils down to tax take, it boils down to people. And the failure to get a deal on the financial professional services component is bad for the UK. Without getting too into the weeds on derivatives, because I'm conscious that not everybody will find that rocket science the most riveting of topics to talk about on a webinar. Time-limited equivalence decisions from the European Union on clearing, for example, or trading, really is a sticky plaster. It doesn't fix the problem. We had pressure long before the referendum from the EU to relocate euro-denominated trading and clearing onto the continent. That was seen to be, and I have some sympathy with the view, of systemic importance to the European regulators and supervision. Now that we've left the European Union, that's even more pronounced from their point of view. Where we are at the moment is we've effectively got the UK permitting cross-border business into the UK from the EU. That's sort of broad position of the British government and Treasury and Financial Conduct Authority and others. But British businesses doing business cross-border into Europe is a real problem. And only today I read that, ICAP has got problems on the brokerage side because they've not been able to move all the people they wanted to move over to Paris as quickly as they could, partly due to the COVID situation. But it means they've had to suspend services from the UK to certain clients in Europe. So this is a really basic and fundamental problem. It needs to be fixed. I think there are some positive signs coming out of the Treasury and the Chancellor on all of this recently. But the longer it goes on, the more unsatisfactory it is. And we really do need, resolution to this if we're to have, what lawyers hate, which is uncertainty. And, some of the workarounds that people have been using on cross-border, like reverse inquiry. So this is where you get an exemption from effectively being required to be authorized and licensed because the client comes to you as opposed to you coming to them. Really, I mean, it's not really working in practice. So, and the people I really worry about actually aren't the large firms. In my very last role at JP Morgan, I was looking very carefully at cross-border business and our footprint in Europe to see how we would, as a financial services firm, continue to do business. I wasn't alone. There were TIM equivalents in all the major firms. It's the SMEs that don't have the time and the resource and the money to do that, who I think are now caught in this very difficult situation where we need some degree of certainty going forward so that people can continue to do business.
And I mean, is the government now negotiating on our behalf? Because we all know what the problem is now. Where is the solution going to come from? Or is the city having to negotiate on its own with the Commission? Well,
we're doing both. I mean, the Corporation of London, which is the city government, has a strategy around continued engagement with the EU. The EU continues to be, our largest overseas market. The logjam around, financial professional services at the high level versus fisheries versus road haulage versus all of the other things. Fundamentally, this is an issue for the government. Now, we will be and continue to play a constructive part in lobbying, influencing, doing the analysis. If you look online at the corporation, you'll see there's a department called Innovation and Growth. They produce some really very well thought through papers. And our job, just to be clear, is not to advocate for Standard Chartered or Citigroup or JP Morgan or Barclays or whoever. They're grown-ups. They're quite capable, frankly, of advocating all on their own. And we're not really even advocating for sectors because there are trade bodies, whether that's ISDA, who I know very well from the derivatives side, who again can do that. What we're there to do is to provide an ecosystem which enables financial and professional services and fintech and green, and we should come to both of those, to flourish. And that is both the physical environment of the square mile.
Tim, am I the only one who's having a bit of a problem? There we go. Okay, would you just repeat that, Tim, because there was a bit of a problem, your last few sentences.
So I was talking about what our role is, which is to provide an ecosystem for financial and professional services to go about doing its business in a successful way, whether that's the physical fabric of the streets and buildings, whether that's high-speed internet, whether that's the broader environment. That's our job. It's not to be an advocate for any particular firm or any particular firm's interest or indeed any particular sector. And that's what we will continue to do. Yeah. And our policy chairman, who is effectively our political leader, Catherine McGuinness, has done a fantastic job in advocating that. And the Lord Mayor, notwithstanding the fact he's physically pretty much constrained to the Mansion House, although I think he has done one overseas trip, is doing a lot of virtual delegations overseas. And indeed, I was on one with him before Christmas to Saudi Arabia. So we'll continue to fulfill that role.
But, the city, and obviously, as you mentioned, the EU is our biggest market. So, we're having to sort of do a bit of pivoting and figure out what our USP is. And green tech has been one of the things that we've alighted on, not least due to Roger Gifford, a former Lord Mayor who now leads the Green Institute. Could you tell us a bit about that and what you see as our advantages there?
So one of the things the city's always been quite good at, actually, is reinventing itself. So we sort of go back to the cultural conversation we had earlier about change and our ability to change. And I have confidence that that can happen on the diversity and inclusion side as well as more broadly. We have been an entrepot of different nationalities and trades and businesses over many, many years. Just look at the street names. Lombard Street was the Italian merchants, Baltic Wharf, etc. So, clearly two areas of huge innovation in the last few years have been green finance and the whole fintech direction. There are very recent reports out on fintech where we are the #1 destination for inward investment. And we've got COP coming up in the autumn, and Roger has been doing a fantastic job leading the city's contribution to that piece. So, for every industry that sort of disappears through change, you can renew with new sectors, and we are seeing huge growth on both the green finance agenda and in fintech. You asked me, I think, a question specifically about sort of competitive advantage, and the Lord Mayor is very keen on this. So all due deference to William, our current Lord Mayor, and I talked about the ecosystem. The ecosystem is more than the physical fabric and internet speeds. It's the whole offering, and London is still a great global city. We may not be enjoying everything it has to offer at the moment due to lockdown, but if you look at the cultural footprint, you look at the quality of education, and yes, we all moan and bitch about transport infrastructure, but actually there's some amazing new things coming on stream with Crossrail and so forth. London is still a great city with many advantages, and it's that all-round package that really differentiates. And frankly, nobody can replicate, certainly not soon. It's not as if you've got a ready-made location in Europe that exactly duplicates what London can offer. And you see that actually in the proof of the pudding, in the sense that where have businesses gone when they've decided to redeploy particular types of activity? Well, it's not all to Paris. You've seen some asset management activity to Paris, bit to Dublin, banking onto Frankfurt. It's scattered. It's not as though everyone just up sticks and off we go to Amsterdam or wherever. So I'm very much glass half full on this. That's not to say that we don't have challenges, but green and fintech clearly are two big opportunity areas for us.
Fintech, green, going back to what you mentioned, Lombard Street, obviously referring to the Italians who came over. Immigration is crucial in terms of, the city, whatever its faults on the number of diversity and inclusion, and however backward it may seem to itself, now that we're aware of where we should be, when it comes to global, it is just so global. And walking in the streets of the city, before COVID, you heard different languages, and that talent from all over the world is something that this government seems to have a bit of an issue with, and their focus is very much on, there's some great little tech visas, but tech doesn't live on its own. It's not just computer scientists, it's all sorts of other people within those firms and within other firms. What do you think about the government's current immigration policy? Is it helpful to the city, or does it need some tweaking?
So I think the jury is out on that as far as financial and professional services goes. We almost go back to the question you asked me around derivatives. If the business activity isn't actually located here in the first place, then the visa regime, frankly, is academic because the jobs aren't there to fill. So let's start with sort of that threshold question. If the jobs are there, then these tend to be highly skilled, technically focused and demanding jobs. We're talking about, graduate level employment here. And even in a points-based system, I think those would still attract overseas talent, assuming we haven't had a mass migration of the jobs themselves. So I think this is early days, and I think we have COVID, of course, so we don't really have an active hospitality sector. But I think where it really hits is in that sort of area, not so much in the highly paid specialized technical skill sets on FPS. Now, that's not to say, of course, that there aren't jobs in the financial professional services sector that are less skilled than others. So that there clearly is an issue there potentially around mobility of talent into the UK. But I don't know the answer to that yet. I think, you know, my threshold concern actually is, can we keep the jobs here, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to ask you something, going back to that point you made about sort of the virtual trip to Saudi. Saudi has pretty terrible laws against anybody who's LBGT. Would this sort of a trip to Saudi, to Zimbabwe, would any of this be an issue for you when, or should I say, if you become Lord Mayor?
Well, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is no. Look, the longer answer is, you know, you occupy the office. You know, you just happen to be the person for that year who is privileged enough to serve in that office. And I think, you know, park ego and personal opinions to one side, it's a job. And the job is, bottom line, to spend about 135 days a year traveling overseas. You're not even in London, where you're the Lord Mayor, to 28 countries promoting financial and professional services. It's not to get on a plane and wave the rainbow flag, or whatever other cause happens to be in your court. And we've had female Lord Mayors, two in fact, and the most recent one, Fiona, who went to the Middle East. And I think, look, inclusion is also about mutual respect. So whatever my personal views on criminalizing consensual acts between adults, I will respect the laws of any country that I go to. Now, that doesn't mean if I'm asked a question, I'm not going to answer the question. And it doesn't mean that I'm prepared to not be who I am. It's a matter of public record, what my views are on things and who I am. But let's focus on the job. And the job is that promotional ambassadorial role. So no, I wouldn't have a problem going to wherever I needed to go. It's not entirely in the Lord Mayor's call, to be honest. It's a combination of the corporation and the government who determine where you go in any particular year. So as I said, there's usually about 28 jurisdictions. We had a recent debate in the Common Council on China, which I know is a hugely emotive issue for many people. And I indeed went to China when I was sheriff with the then Lord Mayor. And I said in Common Council on China, I said, look, international foreign policy is for Her Majesty's government to determine. It's not for the Corporation of London or the Common Council of the Corporation of London. And so if the government says that, you know, part of the programme is to go to countries like China or Saudi or wherever, then that's part of the deal.
Now, tell me a bit more about, you talked about Catherine McGuinness, who is basically the CEO of the city. And one of the things that interested me is how she and the city corporation are also a sort of local authority. They are local government as well as owning vast tracts of London. And where we are in becoming a green city, there are all sorts of interesting, innovative things that are on the agenda there. Could you just share a few of those on this webinar?
Yeah, so we've just passed a green set of policies for the corporation, which looks at our footprint top to bottom to see what we can do, wearing all the various hats that we wear to advance the green agenda. So the City of London Corporation is a very peculiar animal. On one level, I am just a local councillor, and we collect refuse and we sweep the streets and we are the planning authority and we license premises. On the other, of course, and we charge council tax, although we only have about 9,000 residents in the City of London and about 370,000 odd people physically working in the city on a normal non-COVID pandemic day. So yes, there is that piece. We are also very fortunate and privileged enough to have accumulated property investments and green spaces over the centuries. So, for example, we run and provide Hampstead Heath, Epping Forest. We run the wholesale markets that provide fish, meat and vegetables to the whole of Greater London. People will know Billingsgate and Spitalfields from there. We're in the process of looking very carefully at consolidating them into a single hub, which would transform the way in which food supply is provided to London. And we also have this, strange set of peculiar pseudo-national roles, starting with the mayoralty. So there are a whole series of levels there in terms of what the corporation does relative to your local council. In some way, I live in Greenwich, where unsurprisingly, Greenwich does things in Greenwich. The City of London Corporation is a local authority that isn't local, because you will know from some of the things I just said, lots of things we're running aren't even in the square mile. Same for our social housing. Most of our social housing is Southwark, Islington, Hackney. We run city academies outside of the city. So where that's going in terms of your question is that gives us many, many different levers to look at in looking at what we do and how we do things from the green perspective, whether that's what we invest in, how our properties are run, how we source energy, how we structure the urban environment. So look to the planning plan, for example. It's clear that there will be a shift away from vehicular traffic, increasingly to pedestrianisation in the square mile. You've seen that with some of the cycle highway work that's gone in. When Crossrail comes online, it will significantly increase the number of people footfalling into the city. All of these dimensions are part of what we're looking at as an organisation around how green is green.
What about, because what ties into that is the post-COVID world, and in financial and professional services, it's actually been relatively easy to do the working from home part. And we've also realized, most people want more flexibility. I mean, I looked at, I think Schroders did a questionnaire to all its employees, and 85% of them said they wanted more flexibility about when they came into the office and how they worked. And there is, I'd say, of all the CEOs and chairs I've talked to, the consensus is that about a third less office space will be needed. What's your view on that and the effect it would have on the city?
Well, maybe. I mean, look, my guess of the new normal is as good as your guess or anyone else's guess. Schroders actually is one of the largest firms in my ward. I know Peter, the CEO, very well. And I certainly think that the new normal won't be the same as the old normal, because we've all discovered...
Tim, could you, I think we just lost you there.
Yeah, so Schroders, if you caught me, Schroders is one of the largest firms in my ward. And I think that we've all discovered different ways of working through this crisis. My parents have discovered Zoom calls, which is truly frightening, as we now have family conference Zooms. But what that looks like on the other side, I don't know. What I do think, though, is that the need for physical space will always be there. There is nothing quite that can substitute the physical meeting of people and the interaction that you get face-to-face, talking in a meeting. So I think the demise of the city urban is probably over-egged. But yes, I certainly think there will be change that we see as a consequence of the pandemic.
Now, let me just take a few questions. Now, this is, what do you think of a central London zero emission zone, possibly with next generation road user charging? How far should the city go in terms of piloting other smart city technologies?
So I could duck out of that and say that that's Sadiq Khan's call, because of course he holds party political elected office, and that is ultimately a matter for the GLA and for him. I won't duck it entirely. Look, I think the challenge here, of course, is we all want, I think, to get to an end result which addresses these issues. It's the speed with which we go and what we can afford to do in terms of transitioning change and the cost of that. You have seen in the square mile, broadening of pavements. As I mentioned, the pedestrian piece of the planning agenda is definitely taking priority. You've seen more cycle lanes open, there's been road closures. And we've got to balance that, of course, against the fact that this, in normal times, is a functioning city and you need deliveries of stuff into offices and buildings and businesses. One of the things I mentioned in passing was the consolidation of the markets program. We currently have heavy road traffic coming into the heart of the city at Smithfield to deliver meat. Okay, it's done in the early hours of the morning, but it must be sensible in 2021 to be looking at hubbing the whole distribution model in a more sensible way. I mean, we can obviously still provide the facilities, and that's what we're potentially looking out at Barking to do. And then the question is, well, how do you then get the goods from there into central Greater London? And you can be creative about the way that you do that. Whether we're looking at the river again, for example, which is in modern times an underutilized resource, but historically was the beating artery of the city's commercial life. So yes, electrification, that comes with challenges because, of course, you have to put the physical infrastructure in place to allow charging. We've got some charging locations in the square mile, but not that many. So I'm with you on the aspiration. I will defer to Sadiq or whoever, when the elections eventually come, is Mayor of Greater London, which is, of course, not the same as the Lord Mayor. But yes, I mean, we are looking at what we can do as an organisation around piloting technology and what's within our control to change.
Now, Tim, a good question here is, what do you think the City of London of 2030 will look like?
Oh, gosh. I suspect that traffic will be much lower and will probably be limited in terms of times of accessibility. There is a limit to what we can do about the physical fabric. So as planning authority, of course, you'll note that we've given permissioning for various high-rise developments, but they're all clustered in pretty much one location, which is out to the east around Lime Street. That's partly to do with heritage views to St. Paul's and other cultural heritage considerations. I think there is a big aspiration on the part of the corporation to enhance culture through the so-called Cultural Mile initiative, which involves...
Meaning, could you, just for those, more museums and...
So if we relocate Smithfield, for example, to a central wholesale markets centre, that would free up that location for the relocation of the Museum of London, and we could turn that area into a cultural centre district stretching from Smithfield all the way through to the Barbican. I mentioned the things that the corporation does that's unusual relative to other local authorities. We run the Barbican, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. So there's a very rich cultural offering there from the city. If we move the Museum of London, that of course frees that site up. There have been proposals to build a new concert hall there. That's still early days. But if I sit here in 2021 and chuck the eyes and fast forward to 2030 or 2030? Those are the sorts of things that we could see as transformative in both the physical fabric and the shape of the city.
And what about the culture of the city, which is where we started this conversation?
Yeah, I think clearly the pace of change in the technology side is phenomenal, and albeit a few years ago when I was in China, nobody uses money anymore. It's all on WeChat and your QR code, and it's all swipe with the phone, and that direction clearly is where we're going. So that changes the nature of payment interactions. it changes the nature of business, and that's going to continue apace. And the city is no more immune to that than anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually talking about diversity and inclusion. Will we have had a few openly gay Lord Mayors? Will we have had a few more women? 2 in God knows how many years is rather pathetic. Do you see major change happening there?
Well, if I have anything to do with it, you know what the answer is going to be. Yes, look, I think, as I said, it's work in progress. We need to change some of the way in which the structures of the offices work. We've done that already. So look, it's no secret that if you go back 20 years, there were huge financial barriers to entry. We still have some, but it's not quite, the rich white guy is the only eligible person really in terms of what the job demands. In terms of diversity on the court, these are elected offices. And so at the end of the day, I want to encourage, and I will do it now on this webinar, I want people to step forward and offer to serve in these elected offices. They are voluntary and they don't pay. And personally, I'm very ambivalent. I mean that in the genuine sense of that word, about that, because I think the minute we payroll them, they will probably go party political. And I'm not personally in favour of that. I think the independent piece is important for the city. But I do want to see more diverse candidates coming through. I do want to see more women. I want to see more people from BAME backgrounds. At the heart of my commitment to doing this is I've never believed that I work in a vacuum. Whether I was a solicitor in private practice or a lawyer at JP Morgan, these firms operate in that ecosystem. And I think we have a responsibility to ensure that that ecosystem reflects who we are and allows everyone to flourish. So that's why I put my hand up in 2013 and ran for elected office as alderman. So yes, I would encourage people who want a sense of community and service. This is a great thing to do, and you don't have to be a member of a political party. In fact, I'd prefer it if you weren't. You just have to effectively want to have the commitment and the spirit to make change.
This is a question actually from my co-director, Associate Professor Grace Lorden. She's interested in your thoughts on the hidden workforce, basically the outsourced workforce, security guards, canteen workers, and whether you feel we're too segregated in terms of inclusion. We're including full-time employees, but we're not including these outsourced workers who are really a huge part of the city in its entirety.
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. They work in the same environment I work in. I suppose the question is, for an employer, where does your principal responsibility lie? If you're having a staff network, for example, is that staff, i.e. people who are full-time employees, or is it anyone who steps foot in the building? And I do think there's probably an area there I think the word you used was hidden, maybe forgotten is better. And particularly where you're self-employed and you don't have those infrastructures and support networks. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer. I suspect if we lifted the lid, we'd find that different firms have different attitudes in terms of accessibility to, say, staff networks and support for people working there, whether that's part-time employees or full-time employees or others. I know, having worked in 2 large organizations, that when it comes to staff networks, it's top to bottom. So we didn't have an LGBT staff network just for the lawyers or the bankers or the traders. It was everybody. And if I look at the corporation, our staff network is absolutely across the entire footprint of the organization. On the non-elected member side, so it's staff, it's not elected members. As an elected member, of course, I can provide a voice of support and encouragement, and I constantly do. But our our employee network, I'm pretty sure, is across the footprint of the corporation organisation, and we are a very diverse in the sense of what we deliver a body, given the things I've described that we do, whether that's people working in Epping Forest as park rangers or park staff, whether it's traffic wardens, whether it's people in the surveyors department or the town clerks or the finance department. It's a very diverse group of people.
Obstacles. What is there an obstacle or two obstacles that, if removed, you feel it would bring us towards a more inclusive city?
If that's inclusive in the diversity sense of the word, I think we've touched on most of the tools and levers that we can deploy. If it's diverse in a much broader sense, then these are well-known challenges. So it's about the affordability of housing, it's about transport, it's about key workers, and both of those issues. So if that's city in the bigger sense, then those are political problems that I'm not qualified to come up with a magic solution on. If I think it's about things that are within my control in the office that I currently hold, or indeed one that I hope to hold in the fullness of time, then I think the messaging and the perception and the symbolism points are really very important. So I don't want to be constantly banging on the one tune, as it were, or the drum, or whatever the right analogy is. But I think just being in the same way that we now have a female vice president of the United States, that sends a very powerful message, and we need more of this.
What, very good question here. What key messages would you be giving globally about London when visiting foreign countries?
Well, I think we're back to the London is an amazing place with a unique set of advantages. And that is still true. It's still true post-Brexit. And this office, the Mayoralty, has existed, as I said at the outset, since 1189. We've been through a few things in our time, whether that's the Black Death, the odd fire, a couple of wars. So there have been, significant watershed moments in the history of the City of London. I don't mean that now in the narrow geographical sense, but let's run with that for a moment. And the city has always bounced back. So, I don't want to proselytize any particular political party line about, free trade and striking us on our own and so forth. I personally see London as in a unique situation. We have many advantages. We've got the time zone. We've got our geographical location between the East and the West. I personally think making a choice between the two is a false choice. Of course, there will be challenges doing business in various places from various times. We may not like some administrations relative to others, but London is a city that has come about over centuries. And yeah, if you started from scratch tomorrow, you probably wouldn't invent it the way that it is. But it is nonetheless a unique byproduct of its history. And I think that's something to be proud of. And I think it actually gives us competitive advantage, whether that's the language, whether that's the time zone, whether that's the physical location, whether it's the ecosystem, whether it is the criticality of the mass of interconnected segments of financial and professional services, whether that's the rule of law, whether that's banking, whether it's tech, whether it's green, whether it's asset management, whether it's insurance. This place is still a pretty unique place in the world. And I think that's a very powerful message to be able to articulate.
Now, a question here is, you rose up the ranks to some pretty big roles at JP Morgan, and yet you then joined Five Islands Capital, a fintech startup, where presumably, when you lift up the phone, that was such an old-fashioned phrase, when you call tech support, you are tech support, you are everything. I mean, what was the attraction in getting from one of the best, largest banks in the world to a small fintech operation?
Well, I'm quite sure if my colleagues were on the phone now, they would tell you that I'm the least tech-savvy lawyer they've ever met in their lives, and yet I'm the general counsel in a fintech. I'm very much press the button, and if it doesn't work, I sort of have a bit of a meltdown. But you know, it's incredibly exciting. I mean, the differences, I suppose, are you go from being institutionalized. I was 20 years at JP Morgan, where I had some idea of what was going to happen next, to literally 4 of you in a startup chasing investor capital raising with an amazing product that we all believe passionately in. That's incredibly exciting, but absolutely scary at the same time. So it's very, very different. You know, I think the combination of the two is fascinating. You know, if I were to be fortunate enough to go forward to higher office, I would have effectively done the two extremes, if you like, across the spectrum of the ecosystem that's the city. I've been a traditional lawyer in a you know, a top law firm as a banking and derivatives lawyer. I've been a managing director and a global practice in a very large financial services conglomerate, probably one of the preeminent banking firms in the world. And I've been in a fintech startup. I mean, you couldn't really make it up, really. But actually, as we're talking about diversity, you couldn't really get a more diverse range of experiences there. And that's part of why I find it really quite exciting. I mean, it's quite a ride. So it's very different to the predictability of my day job at JP Morgan. But yeah, no, very, very exciting.
The last question, and you only have about a minute or so to answer this. What would your advice be to your younger self?
I would have listened more and spoken less. And I think, look, whatever our backgrounds, wherever we come from, all of us have implicit biases, and all of us have assumptions. I mentioned very early in my career being articled to a lawyer who was an evangelical Christian. And it doesn't really matter what segment of the community you come from. We all have it. LGBT do just as much as BAME or anyone else. So I think listening is key. I think being open-minded is key. And I think, understanding that there are different lived experiences, different perspectives out there that should be listened to is really important. And I think the younger me was probably too impetuous, perhaps too driven. I've always been ambitious, and maybe I should have shut up more than I did. I don't know whether that answers your question, Karina, but I think probably does.
Tim, it absolutely does. And it's the sort of advice that, one gets older, one thinks about advice. But of course, when you're young, life's different and your feelings are different and everything.
Enthusiasm.
But we want to thank you.
Pleasure.
But thank you so much for participating in this and helping. That last question was asking you for advice, but in a way, all of it, the whole hour was about your advice, because your lived experience and what you've gone through and what you've seen and what's going to happen to the city. I mean, all of this is so incredibly important for those who are listening and for the city itself. So many thanks to Alderman Tim Hailes, who we look forward to interviewing again in a few years, dressed in his robes of office as Lord Mayor of the City of London, subject to election, I must always say that. Do tune in for our next Open Door, Open City webinars with entrepreneur and board member Tom Ilube, Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith, whose report on social mobility and progression at work is bound to cause a stir, and with Poppy Jarman, CEO of the City Mental Health Alliance. From all of us here at the Inclusion Initiative, thank you most of all to Tim Hailes and to our audience for listening, and see you soon.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone.